And we're often implementing treaties that are already obsolete. And if you, in every hemisphere, in every latitude, we are experiencing climate change as a different set of crises. If you go as far north as where I live in Ontario and further north in Canada, we're experiencing the climate crisis not as a 2 degrees Celsius change. We've already passed that. Our forests, our province, will experience now, regardless of anything we do on this planet, an 8 degrees Celsius temperature change in the winter and a 4 degrees Celsius temperature change in the summer. That's if we keep it under 2 degrees Celsius, and the Paris Agreement, if implemented with no slippage, takes us by mid-century to about 3.7 degrees Celsius, which means that forest warms up a lot more than 8 degrees Celsius. So the question is one of time, because Paris is an interesting agreement, and it's a very flexible agreement. And the bigger responsibility, I would say, what my friend from Mexico said, is the lane changing factor. So when we made our INDCs, we all committed to a certain lane. Some slow lanes, some medium lanes, and some fast lanes. I would say Ontario at 37% by 2030, already at more than 6% below 1990 levels, which is in the Americas, with Quebec probably some of the largest reductions that have been made. We're one of the few jurisdictions that's already under 1990 levels. We're also 75% of Canada's heavy industry, and we're one of the heaviest resource extraction industries in the world, with a lot of steel plants and a lot of industrial heavy emissions industry, more than any other Canadian province. And after Mexico, Mexico is the largest auto manufacturing economy in North America. We are the second largest in Ontario. We have the second largest, now we're very close. So what Mexico does in pricing carbon and how it manages its auto sector is also important to Ontario, because we have to work as governments to protect our workers. We get threatened sometimes, or it's suggested privately to us, if we're too rigid on climate change, well, the people will just move their plants to Mexico. And Mexico will then have the problem of it, when it becomes more stringent, of employers saying to the Mexican, we can't do that because we'll move the jobs. So we have to work as governments so we don't get played and bullied into an attack on workers, attack on investments and things like that. So the question is, we have to stay in our lane. We can't go slower. And we probably all have to move into a faster lane if we're going to get it to 1.5. Everyone's actually going to have to, in the next near future, do that. So the question is, now that we know what the lane widths are and what the lane changing width is, the question is, a Thelma and Louise question, as I call it, how much lane do we have before we go over the cliff? And I think that's the uncomfortable conversation. That's the biggest elephant in the room. Because the science since Paris has been interesting. We talk a lot about forests. Over half the coverage of our country is a boreal forest. We share that with Russia and the Scandinavian countries. So all of our emissions reduction plans we tabled at Paris had nothing to do with the health of our forests. It assumes they're going to be healthy, and they will be, it's one-third of all forest carbon absorption is the boreal forest. We're assuming in all of our plans that forest continues absorbing carbon dioxide. So how consequential is that forest? We should know that, shouldn't we? That would be a big question for us as human beings. And I can't speak to the rainforest in South America. People there can speak to that. But the big question is, how long does that forest do that? Because every year, the boreal forest alone absorbs 26 years of human and industrial emissions. So it absorbs every year all of our emissions and 25 times as much from other natural sources, right? We know our boreal, most of the large trees, the spruce trees, black and white, will not survive a 4 or 5 degrees Celsius change, never mind an 8 degrees Celsius change, which we're locked into. So what's our forestry management program? We need an urgent conversation at the UN level about protecting the integrity of forests as carbon sinks, because I think the assumptions that are coming out of Yale University, out of Trent, the NASA Above project on the boreal forest are all showing evidence we don't have the healthy forests we thought, even we thought when we signed that agreement. The second thing, the oceans. I was on vacation in the United Kingdom. They're saying, as many of us read, oceans may have less than 20 years of carbon absorption. We're relying on the oceans for what I think 35, 40% of emissions. So we're already past that point where we only have to look at our emissions reductions. So implementing COP21 is get off your butt and start dealing with internalizing that science. And I always say this to business leaders. You talk to me first about that boreal forest that you're cutting trees in. How much absorption power does it have? So it's the speed at which we can translate science into public policy that has to happen. So from Ontario's perspective, our implementation locally, our action plan, which is about an $8 billion plan, which you can see, it's not that different than others. It's retrofitting buildings. 35% of our emissions come from vehicles, electric vehicles, mass public transit, electric charging. It's all of that kind of stuff. But that's the other piece of it, is how little time do we have left? I don't think it's very much. And I think the doubling down we have to do is going to be very important. I don't think we need new technologies. But the other issue is, as a subnational government, or as my friend David Hertel calls it, an infranational government, what's our role? How do we make this happen? Because we're hoping Mexico joins us in this carbon pricing, because we think there's issues of poverty reduction, which Mexico has had some debates about. We share that. We have a mass amount of money going into social housing. We have a mass amount of money going into affordable transit, to cycling, to the transportation and housing choices of low-income people. And we can't get into a debate around cap and trade versus tax over that, because you can have a tax system that can be unjust, attack low-income people, as you can have a cap and trade system. But the other thing I want to say is, there's just to talk about what Tim said, which is this fetish. I actually don't think it's just a fetish. I think it's the people who are opposed to climate change action are getting smarter. They have detached, up until Paris, when you were in favor of carbon pricing, you were in favor of greenhouse gas reductions. No one questioned that. Now, those same politicians in Canada, who for 10 years have opposed any actions, are now in favor of revenue-neutral carbon taxes that do not reduce emissions. And the difference between Shannon, myself, and David, and all of us up here, is all of ours. I don't care what the carbon price is. I don't care if the market generated $50 million or $75 million. You need a cap, like Nova Scotia has, you need a cap, you need a cap decline rate, and you need a price sufficient to drive emissions down, and you need a pool of capital to ensure social justice and help with financial transformation. That's what this is about. The economic fetish isn't just a polite debate about academics. It's actually smart politics by the people who are opposed to climate action, who say they're in favor of a carbon price, believing that it's synonymous with carbon action. And all of us who are politicians, and all of you, have to be very mindful of that. And the litmus test is GHG reductions and social justice and equity and a just economic transformation. The litmus test isn't how big your carbon price is. The litmus test is, are your reductions sufficient and just? And it really rests for me. The California, Quebec, Ontario, it's not just about cap and trade. If all of us aren't working to try and create a global and continental system, then you have a leakage issue. Because it's very hard for Ontario now when Michigan has no carbon price. You know, the sooner that Mexico, California, Quebec, Ontario, Quebec, and whatever else that, we need a North American carbon price. That's the only economic and job protection security that avoids carbon leakage, increased emissions, and a uniform economy. So we're impatient. As Ontario, we're impatient now. We've been waiting politely, as have many. We need all governments to work on global carbon pricing, because it's unfair if Ontario and Quebec and Alberta have a carbon price and Michigan and Iowa and Georgia don't. That's unfair, and it's time for us to call out those jurisdictions that aren't doing their job. And it's time for us to start thinking about prices at our borders. You want to sell in our market? You want to sell it to Mexico? You want to sell it to California? Then we're going to put a price at the border, because It's unjust and it's unfair to our workers, and it's unfair because the lowest income people are absorbing the greatest climate impacts, and their jobs are most at risk. So I want to give a shout out to Mexico, whose announcements this morning were about social justice and economic hope and prosperity. It wasn't just about climate change, because you can't de-link the two. So merci, muchas gracias, thank you.
Glenn Murray, muchísimas gracias. Me siento identificada con tu forma de transmitir el compromiso que tienes con lo que estás haciendo. Yo me quedo con la conclusión de que no es lo importante la tarifa que se ponga a la emisión de carbono, y no es lo que se recaude, es el compromiso con frenar las emisiones de carbono y que sea global. Debemos de comprometernos desde las pequeñas ciudades hasta todos los países del mundo para poder estar todos en sintonía y entonces ver los resultados a corto, mediano y largo plazo, porque lo que dices es cierto. Esta referencia a la película de Thelma and Louise es cierto, es cuánto nos queda para llegar al barranco. Muchas gracias. Ahora voy a ceder el uso de la voz a nuestra última participante de esta mesa. Ella es Shannon Phillips, ministra de Medio Ambiente y Parques de la provincia de Alberta, Canadá. Ella es egresada de la Universidad de Alberta, se graduó con honores y tiene una maestría en Ciencias Políticas. Ha colaborado en distintas ocasiones en la legislatura de Alberta y es analista de la política económica dentro de la Federación Laboral de Alberta, donde trabajó mucho en el área de energía y cuestiones relacionadas con el medio ambiente. También se desempeñó como presidenta del grupo Women's Space Lethbridge. Muchas gracias, Shannon. Te cedo el uso de la voz.
Can you hear me now? There, it's working now, I think. So thank you, and thank you to the state of Jalisco for hosting the Climate Summit of the Americas. For almost 20 years, Jalisco has been a sister state to the province of Alberta, and has a number of partnerships with the state, and we certainly appreciate those partnerships. We appreciate the opportunity to be here for the Climate Summit and to actually deepen those partnerships around technology and innovation, agriculture and value-added processing, as well as our partnerships in the education sector. And I think that there are new partnership opportunities with Alberta's renewed focus, or new Alberta is Canada's largest oil and gas producer, and we are in fact the United States their largest customer, and so we provide the United States with the majority of their oil and gas, and as such we have a very high emissions profile. And prior to about 14 months ago, Alberta did not have a coherent climate change strategy, so much so that attendance at international meetings was a process of avoiding embarrassment rather than discussing moving the province forward. In the past 15 months since the change of government, we have brought in an economy-wide price on carbon. We brought in a piece of legislation that dictates that an eventual $30 per ton by 2018 in an economy-wide way will be either directed towards equity, that is to say adjustments for lower and middle income people, or programs. So programs in green infrastructure, programs in Indigenous community energy projects, programs with respect to research and technology to help our oil and gas industry make those transitions to a lower carbon and carbon competitive future that we know is coming for all of the reasons that Minister Murray outlined earlier. And so it's a specific type of challenge in Alberta. It is a challenge that requires a tremendous pool of capital, in fact, in order to effect the changes that we want to see. Because we are a resource-dependent economy, we have hitherto relied for almost our entire government revenues and almost our entire economy on one commodity, one price, one market, which is the United States. And so with the drop in the price of oil, that dependency has come to us in stark relief. We've lost 90% of our resource royalty revenue into the government coffers, and it's thrown tens of thousands of people out of work. So this is very real, this challenge of how to transition an economy in Alberta, and it's very real in terms of its effect on how we can lead the transition for the people who buy our oil and gas, and the companies with whom we partner and the jurisdictions with whom we partner across the continent and around the world in terms of the research and development and technology and innovation that we export. So we have done those things in addition to phasing out coal-fired electricity. Alberta currently burns more coal than the rest of the country combined. That situation is poised to reverse itself beginning in 2018-2019 with the first of the coal-fired shutdowns. 2/3 of that coal capacity will be replaced by renewables. You have to go almost as far south as Guadalajara to find as good a solar resource as we have in southern Alberta. And we also have a tremendous wind resource. So that combined with some clever ways to do interties with our other partners will transition our electricity system. All this is to say that the way to reduce our emissions, and from our perspective, we have to begin with those steps. Alberta, to use Minister Murray's analogy, was not even on the highway, let alone in a lane, prior to 15 months ago. And so we are seized with the urgency, and we understand the urgency. At the same time, we are also seized with the urgency of the most bone-crushing recession in a generation that has faced our province. And so those measures need to be taken thoughtfully and moderately, and that's exactly the approach that we have taken. The final thing that I want to talk about is our methane commitments, and we'll be putting these into legislation soon. We've committed to 45% reduction off 2014 levels, by 2025, and that target was essentially adopted by the province of British Columbia and Saskatchewan, the government of Canada, then subsequently through an agreement with the United States, and subsequently at the Three Amigos Summit as was posited as an aspirational goal for Mexico as well. We believe that goal will be significant because short-lived climate pollutants are a pressing issue. We think that our province can exercise the kind of leadership that the continent needs on that topic. The approach that we are going to take is through a crediting system for the first couple of years with a regulatory backstop. Speaking to what Tim was saying before, none of this will have the kind of policy resilience it needs in the kind of polarized political environment in which I operate every day without legislative and regulatory backstops, and that's exactly what we intend to do. Finally, I guess on that one piece, that wasn't the finally. We have plans to, we'll be going into the House, I believe this fall, with a cap on our oil sands emissions. Of course, Alberta's oil sands have been a lightning rod for conversations about Canadian commitment to climate policies more broadly. We feel that Alberta's movement on capping oil sands emissions and introducing the economy-wide price and other initiatives have been able to turn down that conversation so that we can have a conversation about Canadian natural resources based on their own merits. And their individual effects on communities. And this is not to take away from the seriousness of those conversations and the seriousness with which we must take our reconciliation with Indigenous communities and others. But it is to say that it's more helpful to have a fact-based, drama-free conversation about those topics. And that's one of the reasons why industry supported us in bringing in a cap on oil sands emissions at 100 megatons annually. We're only at 70 now. So it does allow for growth, but it does say to industry, look, yes, you may grow, but you must do so responsibly and you must reduce the carbon in the barrel. And that will be legislated as well in order to give that policy some level of resilience. So those are the thoughts I have to share with you, and I certainly welcome our future conversations together. I believe that on some of the topics that I've spoken about, we can only achieve our goals through pan-continental or hemispheric action. And from our perspective, we've brought in an economy-wide price on carbon. Those revenues will be used to transition our economy. So thank you.
Shannon Phillips, muchísimas gracias por compartirnos tu experiencia en Alberta, por transmitirnos esto que en México nos queda como de tarea y una lección, que la comunidad de industriales tienen el compromiso de hacer una reducción, y al mismo tiempo no solamente es el compromiso de la comunidad industrial, sino también viene acompañado de créditos para subsidios y de un freno legislativo y regulatorio. Debemos de usar energías más limpias, pero no es un asunto de una sola persona o de un solo ente. Es el compromiso que genera la sociedad y un colectivo, porque no nos basta solo con tener leyes. Podemos estar llenos de regulaciones, de leyes, de castigos, pero tiene que funcionar y ver los resultados a partir de los compromisos. Así que bueno, nos llevamos mucha tarea a todos los que estamos aquí, y el compromiso de que el freno al cambio climático vaya de forma multifactorial y multisectorial. Solo que les tengo una pequeña mala noticia: el tiempo se nos acabó para hacer preguntas en lo individual. Pero sí, no quisiera que nos fuéramos y alguien por ahí tuviera alguna pregunta. Yo los invito a que por ahí levanten la mano si alguien tiene una pregunta y la hacemos breve, y que también la respuesta a quien se la hagamos sea lo más breve posible, porque tenemos después una conferencia magistral. Y también, bueno, pues si alguien se queda con más preguntas, pues nos ponemos en comunicación con ellos vía electrónica. No sé si estén de acuerdo con eso, pero si hay alguien ahorita que tenga alguna pregunta o aportación. Subsecretario, ¿no? Ya pregunta mucho siempre. ¿Alguien? ¿Nadie?
Virginie Lévesque de l'Ambassade du Canada. We've heard from the Canadian ministers how the funds that are being generated by carbon tax or by the cap and trade are used to promote innovation and specifically used in that sense. I was wondering if the representative from Semarnat could tell us in the pilot project they have and with the plan to eventually join that type of system, if the idea is also to use the revenues to invest in innovation in that sense.
Pues muy rápidamente creo que sí, que esa es la idea, ¿no? Tenemos, como yo mencioné en la presentación, un fondo de cambio climático. Todavía no hemos logrado, pero estamos en pláticas con las autoridades fiscales, ¿no? Lograr por lo menos que un porcentaje del carbon tax o en su momento el ETS o de los revenues que se puedan obtener se destinen, a este fondo para financiar proyectos de adaptación o mitigación al cambio climático. Esa es la idea, ¿no? Y pues conocemos bien cómo funciona el de Quebec. La vez pasada el ministro Hertel vino a México y nos dio una gran presentación de cómo funciona el Fondo de Quebec, y será seguro de las lecciones que vamos a aprender en esta nueva relación, en estos diálogos de América del Norte.
¿Tenemos tiempo de otra pregunta? Tenemos quizá 2 minutos para otra pregunta. ¿Alguien más que quiera hacer alguna pregunta? Allá atrás.
Thanks. This is especially a question for Richard Corey or the Canadians. We have heard some of the themes that you suggest are important for reducing emissions, like profound economic analysis and a general scoping plan, which is fantastic. But what about if you are in a resource-constrained context where you don't have the funds for conducting economic analysis? How would you go about reducing emissions in a more resource-constrained context?
Never give the mic to a former employee. So there's never going to be enough money. That's a fact. So to me, the fundamental question about strategically applying the dollars that are there is the same challenge we're all going to face. We face now, so it's not as though I would argue that we face that same challenge. And to me, where we're going to have to go, and as I look at the policies that are already on the table, they are, what are those that are going to be sustainable from an economic standpoint? We gave the argument, the statement was made by a few folks here in terms of the role that zero-emission vehicles play, both from a climate standpoint, and I would argue from a range of other benefits too, from in terms of toxics and clean air and a range of other economic benefits that those investments are playing. So if I think about your question, we're certainly providing incentives for electric vehicles today. But our whole view is that, and if I look to we originally adopted a zero-emission vehicle regulation 30 years ago. 30 years ago. We weren't able to implement it for many years because the technology simply wasn't there. It's there today, and the battery energy density, the battery costs are going down. Our whole thinking is about when do these strategies become economic, and when do they no longer need rebates? When do they no longer need subsidies? That has to be the thinking going into these things, that the long-term play cannot be these strategies only stand if they're receiving substantial subsidies, and that's got to be the thinking. It's got to be structured to attract public and private dollars. And I'd use the ZEB program as an example of that. We clearly have a regulation, we're clearly providing rebates, but we were already working on what does that exit strategy ultimately look like with respect to rebates, and that structure and those technologies stand on their own. And I would argue that there is daylight in sight on that. And if you don't mind, can I take just 30 seconds, because I wanted to respond to your question as well in terms of cap and trade proceeds, because it was a very timely question given that our legislature and governor acted today to release $900 million from cap and trade proceeds to direct at GHG reductions. They all have to generate GHG reductions. That's a legal requirement. But those are strategically directed to incent and support innovation. Partly electric vehicles, partly heavy-duty applications that are going to move the needle in terms of technologies, energy efficiency investments, some natural resource-related investments, thinking about how, again, can we have transformational investments that are ultimately going to be sustainable and use those dollars as wisely as we can.
Procurador, ¿cómo estamos de tiempo? Ya está, estamos en el tiempo. Entonces, pues si tienen alguna pregunta, la haremos de manera electrónica para que con tiempo nos puedan responder nuestros panelistas. Yo les doy las gracias por la participación, por su honestidad y por la forma tan eficiente en la que nos compartieron su experiencia. Muchísimas gracias y gracias a todos los que nos acompañaron.